Warm welcome to everyone who's joining in. Hope you're having a beautiful day wherever you are in the world. We tend to have a quite broad coverage of the globe. I did get an email from a participant from Australia who regretted that they were not able to join at 11:30 p.m. And we do apologize for that, and hopefully in the future we'll also be able to be navigating the globe and the time zones in different ways. But we're super excited to have you all here for this Inner Development Goals gathering with the title of How Do We Scale Care for Humanity and the Planet Globally, with a wonderful set of participants and contributors with us here today. And I'm really excited to get the conversation going. I do want to start out just landing in the space and with the welcome into this particular, this time that we have together. So I want to invite us all to just slow down and just sense into your body. How do you land into this particular space and time in front of your screen? And perhaps have a little bit of a look around. You're going to be listening and looking perhaps during this coming hour and a half or two that we have together. How do you land in the room that you are or in the space? I see some are in the beautiful outdoors, others are sitting in various rooms. Let's just have a moment to look around and see what catches your eye in your immediate surrounding. Perhaps there's one object or thing that you can just rest at and enjoy the beauty of. I see a tree outside, some willow branches hanging down. And just take a deep breath. A deep breath in. And a deep breath out. We are here now. And this is a moment that we have together to share. All of us joining in from wherever we are. And please feel free to share in the chat where you're joining us from. And have a look at others to see where others are joining from as well in the room. And just ponder as a check-in question. Ponder, what does care mean to me? You can share that in the chat as well. You can choose to just sit with it for yourself. But what does care mean? And if you stay with that question, like, is there a level of depth that you can reach as well, and what care really means? So with that, I just want to give a brief mention of the sort of framework that we're landing into today. This Inner Development Goals gathering, we have some invited contributors who will be sharing with us some perspectives and thoughts from ongoing movement buildings, perspective takings, and also vast experience and research. some of the issues that we're touching today. Scaling care for humanity and the planet. And we'll be having those introductory thoughts and perspectives for the first about hour or so, and then we will have an opportunity, as we always do, for smaller conversations and discussions with you all participants in breakout session. And then after that, we come back and harvest some of the thoughts, ideas, and questions, perhaps, with the panel as well. So that's the format that we have for today. And with that, I want to, with no further ado, I want to introduce or give the floor to Jamie Bristow, who is head of policy development with the Inner Development Goals, and has a vast background in the subject area as well. And Fredrik Lindencrona, who is head of research co-creation as well with the Inner Development Goals. Please take us away and give us the sort of theoretical conceptual framing for the topic that we have in front of us today.
Yes. First of all, it's beautiful to connect to. I'm seeing some green leaves here out in Stockholm or outside my window. So it's a beautiful exercise that you started with, Ola. So thanks for that. This is an initiative that we're doing with a very good and great organization, a network of organizations that we called COP². And we have had the privilege, both Jamie and I, to work a lot with them. I have a long-standing relationship to Gary Belkin, who unfortunately couldn't, out of personal reasons, attend live today, but he's been recording a video. The reason was some personal issues that had to be had taken priority. But he's going to be speaking to you anyhow and inviting you to more co-creation. I'll put the link to COP² for you in the chat so long. So I've been in this field for quite some time, and I personally like quotes. I think they're very helpful tools and elements for resonance. So I'll share two, and then let you reflect about your own process around this, Jamie. The two I've chosen today are these two that I've taken from some recent policy reports. One of the most exciting developments when it comes to international learning and policy, I find, has been several of the latest UNDP Human Development reports. The one in 2020 tries to find a new way of understanding how do we develop human flourishing, inner development, those kinds of elements within planetary boundaries. And I find that this quote says a lot of interesting things, where we probably have to do something with what we value and what we see as means to live a good life to make this work. And the suggestion from the UNDP Human Development Report is to see equity, innovation, and stewardship as central to what it means to live a good life. And in many ways, I think, in my views, our 5 dimensions of being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting are totally the way that we have to use to get to equity, innovation, and stewardship. The other one is a very interesting conclusion that was made in the latest so-called Global Progress Report for Agenda 2030. Bringing together researchers across the whole of the globe to speak about where are we 4 years at that time. There's a new one coming out in 2023. But the overarching conclusion is that humans are the most important factor for sustainable transformation. And that then, of course, human capabilities and well-being are absolutely critical. And I guess that's the path we are on right now. And I hope this today and many other settings, we're going to explore what that means and what to do to use that knowledge and the deep reflection point to act together forward. So Jamie, you want to get your little intro around these things as well?
Thank you, Fredrik. Yes. So we're here to talk about the role of inner capacities and particularly care in meeting the sustainability crises that we face collectively. And this is starting to become a more mainstream interest. The climate crisis has been treated as largely a technical external problem with sort of physical external solutions, but because we haven't acted in over the decades, and in fact, it's being said that the IPCC reports, the UN reports that summarize the evidence of where we are and where we're probably going to be getting to if we don't do anything, haven't really changed their findings over the last 15 years or so. People are starting to ask, where's the IPCC report with that level of rigor about why we haven't acted on IPCC reports? So the question is being asked in many different sort of transnational, negotiation contexts, policy-making contexts, about we've got the policy instruments, we've got the technologies. In many cases, in many countries, we have the kind of popular understanding and popular support for change, but yet still we are stuck. And there's a particular narrative that's sort of bubbling up that frames the climate crisis not primarily, perhaps, as, like I say, a physical crisis, but more of a relationship crisis about human connection, relationships to each other, to nature, and interrelated with that to ourselves. And so what Gary is working with really kind of established mainstream mental health and health institutions and a broad coalition, what Kira is working on from an academic point of view, what the inner development goals are working on from a kind of civil society, advocacy, communications point of view, is all together this reframing, this bringing in of a you could see it as a missing dimension of the predicament and potential solutions, or you could see it as a much deeper level of the predicament, deeper understanding, and deeper leverage point to shift us out of that predicament by acting at the level of the human heart and mind, and particularly at the level of our mindsets, which researchers, experts consider to be perhaps the deepest leverage point, because we have primary stories, primary analogies, ways of seeing the world, which then condition the way in which we relate to it, and what kind of emergent phenomena in society in terms of our structures and processes can then take place. So I'll just give you one little. I mean, that sounds kind of a big soaring statement there, but let's take one little example before I pass on to Gary to explain what he's doing, and that is the connection between self, other, and nature is so interdependent. For instance, if we are embodied, if we are physically present with ourselves and we attend to the bodily stimulus, that underpins our empathy. We actually listen to our bodies when we're listening to others to see how we feel and how we should be responding. So if we're not embodied, if we haven't got that self-awareness, that self-connection, we are much less able to connect to others and indeed to nature and to the planet. So a disembodied citizenry actually stops us being empathetic and stops us to be able to act in our collective best interest. So on that, I will pass over to Gary. Ola, I think, do you want to sort of introduce his title and that kind of thing? Shall I hand over to you for that?
Sure. Thank you. We will hear from Gary now, and he will introduce himself as well, but he is the chair of COP² and the director of the Billion Minds project at Columbia University. So we hand over to Gary to take us from here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Belkin. I have come to you by video. I really regret that I ended up not being able to come to live. I was really looking forward to the back and forth, to the learning, and to the talking about how the effort I'm going to talk to you about and what you're doing can really, has real potential to converge, yield more than the sum of its parts in terms of impact, and really realizing this global-sized ambition of growing psychological strengths that people and neighborhoods and leaders need to take on the environmental crises that we have. I'm going to tell you a bit about COP², and what that's about, and then identify some, at least, initial thoughts on some ways that we can converge efforts to hopefully provoke further conversation. So COP², care people times planet, P², caring for people gives us exponential power to care for the planet. They are intersect and mutually reinforcing. We know a lot about mental health and climate change, but we're really exploding what that means. These are summary reports, examples of recent syntheses of evidence that show that all forms of mental illness, emotional distress are elevated in the face of climate damages and extreme weather events, and their secondary and ongoing chronic effects that disrupt whole communities, livelihoods, food supplies, and threaten the same, which seems to cause its own impairing anxiety, actually increasingly globally and among youth. But all of that expanded burden that is only growing of emotional morbidity also needs to be appreciated, not just as a public health challenge and more suffering and, okay, how do we care for that, but what it's doing to communities, impairing the burden of that impairment on communities to act and stay together and maintain a social fabric. This is the topic of the most recent Human Development Report by the UNDP, which talked about, which connected those dots, that this outsized growing burden of mental illness and distress is making it hard to actually tackle the drivers of that burden collectively. So that also then really elevates the necessity to get serious about investing in psychological strengths, not just playing defense, but playing offense, in terms of what are the skills, capabilities, capacities, mindsets that we need, not just to remain durable and coping through these challenges, but to seize them and to change them. And that it has led to proliferation of ideas, some deeply operationalized out, some not, but a real growing attention as the Inner Development Goals is at the center of how do we do that, what does that mean, and how do we get to scale. So that whole range, outsized mental health needs, outsized community impact, that also need to be addressed by psychological healing and strengthening, and these proactive sorts of skill sets to lead and cope and drive change. That whole spectrum, I will mean when I use terms like mental health or climate change or psychological resilience, it's to capture all of that. And I discovered a lot of organizations, from very small youth climate activists to very large multi-country mental health, grassroots community, NGOs, to everything in between, groups working on violence reduction, working on health and gender and racial and economic equity and justice. All were coming at this same issue of the outsizedness of the psychological resilience agenda, and the need for it to be as a multiplying effect across all these sorts of efforts and purposes. And these are a sampling of the organizations that came together to form what is now the network of COP². And our first effort to actually try to put some of this ambitious way of thinking and this diversity of potentially acting to purpose, to ground, was by convincing the Race to Resilience, which is a UN-led effort to accelerate climate adaptation capacity in the highest climate-affected areas of the world, where 4 billion people live by 2030. And we were able to engage with them, and in their kind of master plan or roadmap plan that they launched in at the last COP, the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda, really has set the milestones and the basic strategy and some key projects that are underway and being launched. That was set out for this effort of climate adaptation, resilience, capacity building. And that effort, we convinced, should also include the purposes of psychological resilience, capacity building, to also reach 4 billion people by 2030. And what we said we would do, and the best way to do it, is to try to do that work embedded within the climate adaptation work. So that meant embedded within these 6 key systems. These are 6 key systems that the Race to Resilience has identified, that their ensemble of effort, mobilizing private sector, city and regional level governments, a whole host of NGOs, private finance, public finance, all to being brought to bear to really exponentially grow climate adaptation in these areas, but in building the resilience of these 6 systems. These are mostly structural, built sort of infrastructural work. And we made the case that you need resilient people for resilient places. And so they agreed to work with us on our developing a plan and strategy for how the Race to Resilience, how these existing efforts, these existing huge channels of reach and impact on climate adaptation could also be channels for absorbing the purposes and aims of psychological resilience building. So that plan, which we're calling a roadmap, is underway. We'll be delivering it at COP, but we're also going to deliver what we're calling early adopters. So that's partners within these 6 systems who are showing how they're going to put that roadmap to work, how they're going to absorb these purposes. So for example, in the human settlement system, we're working with Slum Dwellers International, how to distribute skills so that youth in these informal settlements can lead peer-led emotional support groups. How in the agriculture system sector, where there's a whole range of NGOs that have huge reach to smallholder farmers globally, whether through microfinancing or training in regenerative farming practices or land restoration practices, that are already reaching farmers and credible to them and engaging them, how those points of contact can be filled with, again, proven elements that can be spread and uptake and taken up in these areas that promote psychological resilience again, along that whole potential spectrum of acute needs and psychological strengthening, capacity building opportunities. Those are very on the ground sort of levels. In the finance system that they want to make resilient, for example, we're working potentially on ways to develop methods and consensus of how to capture the value of an investment in psychological strengthening, in psychological resilience investments as part of climate adaptation investments. So that's a kind of a macro structural change that could have real reverberations. So we're going a broad, huge scope, geographies, sectors, kind of systems, as well as at micro and at macro capacity building levels. We really want to show the versatility that the notion that the spread of psychological resilience can have, that it's everyone's business and everyone's opportunity to build out. And doing that builds on actually a lot of experience. For example, some of these, the slum dwellers effort and some of the farmers efforts that would be really putting in the water emotional support skills and really working on that, I guess, caring and distress end of the spectrum of psychological resilience, builds on a huge amount of work that's often been called the field of task sharing, which gives a range of skills into the hands of lay people of all sorts and in all geographies to actually do the work that has often been reserved for mental health professionals, but can actually be done by lay people with mental health professionals serving a much more leveraged role of coaching and supporting them to do that. And this is just a sampling of really the proliferation and range that work has had. And not just on the care side, but also there's a great summary here of what's been called the evolution of nurturing societies, which summarizes key capabilities, a key set of capabilities that runs through a whole, wide decades of work on mental health prevention and promotion. That all of those sort of converge around a handful of key capabilities that, if supported in people, lead to good mental health outcomes and resilience, and impact the communities, a community scale in terms of reduced violence and better education outcomes and better social trust and so forth. So we know how to put to ground and into people's hands some of these hands-on skills that really grow community and individual distress improvement, and at one end of the spectrum, and social fabric building, community building, and psychological growth towards being change makers and tightening collective efficacy. So that spectrum can have a ground game and we already know how to do that. And I put some of those ideas to work when I was New York City Mental Health Commissioner. This map of New York City, each of these dots is a different place, not a mental health clinic. They're job training programs, they're daycare centers, they're houses of worship. They're all sorts of front lines of reaching people with these other skills, with in some way mental health system as a partner to help coach, collaborate, and help them be effective. So it really changes the real estate, as you could see, of how this work across that psychological resilience spectrum can happen. And there are also examples of other large-scaled efforts where community coalitions by grassroots organizations that work on all sorts of areas, housing, racial, economic fairness, et cetera, who come together for the shared work of improving and reaching milestones and measurable benchmarks of promoting well-being. And the 100 Million Healthier Lives effort is one example. Develop toolkits and implementation guides for how to do that. The Wellbeing in the Nation network, and also in the US, developed measuring methods that could be used at a neighborhood or community level to guide local-led initiatives towards those kind of outcome aims. And we see the climate movements also staking out roles of being sources of psychological support, borrowing from a lot of these task shareable skills and crafting new ones, but embedding it and weaving it within the mutual reinforcement of action and building collective efficacy and change making. Susty Vibes in Nigeria, and also the Eco-Anxiety African Project, also based in Nigeria, great examples of a proliferation of this kind of thing globally, new inventiveness about how to put psychological resilience work on the ground. And so we are bringing that learning and that experience and those networks and many NGOs who now do that in many countries, that sort of ground game. We are bringing them into the ecosystem that we're trying to create This is a basic sort of logic framework about how we are developing these early adopter efforts, about how we are implementing this first wave with race resilience partners that can become a replicable method that both allows for the huge diversity, as you can hear from just the few examples I gave of the outcomes at stake, the scale at stake, the populations affected at stake, the skill sets at stake, will vary widely along spectrums and geographies and macro and micro levels of action. But each of them have these common elements, which I'm not going to have time to go into in great detail. Actually, our roadmap is unpacking each of these 5 common process elements and in 5 respective chapters. But I do want to point out 2 in particular, which is this idea that we have decided to put in 2 big lumps along that spectrum of psychological resilience work, that what we're talking about are a lump of capabilities and tools of care, distress reduction, symptom reduction, improvement, et cetera, and of change, collective impact, collective action, how to do change management. Those kinds of skills often have psychological underpinnings and group cohesion and perspective taking kinds of working parts. And so those are our toolkits: care and change, tools and capabilities, that are the stuff of selected to fit, customized to fit what the context demands, that we are pulling from and that we describe and map out a bit more in the roadmap. But this notion of a core set of care and change capabilities and tools that grow and spread them and reinforce them. And then this notion of anchors and paths being, so how does the learning use of those tools and achievement of those capabilities happen? What else does the climate adaptation agents need as an ecosystem of support, of anchor institutions who may do, which might be a health system, which will help do training and skill support. An anchor might help do, do project management. And so this notion of anchors and the paths, the way people get to these skills, are going to be widely different. But the concept of them and building an ecosystem that can then scale with the work. So health systems are everywhere. So in our first micro version of each of these early adopter efforts, if we get the ecosystem right, then all the pieces are themselves scalable elements, is the logic here. So I think there are a lot of resonances in what we're doing, what you're doing, where we're converging and where we're and trying to do actually very similar things, and consilience, where we're doing maybe not so similar things, but in similar ways, using similar raw material and similar working parts. And so I think it would be great to unpack where those overlaps are and to be intentional about amplifying them. So for example, in capabilities and capacities, I mentioned these care and change capabilities. I think there are tremendous overlaps between the kind of package that we're setting up and the IDGs actually. So for example, sorry, I had this list. I'm sorry. I've tried recording this thing so many times, I cannot do it again. Yes, so for example, I mentioned nurture effects, these key capabilities that have all these emanating effects from the psychological prevention promotion literature. So those nurture effects tend to be prosociality, perspective taking, psychological flexibility, which includes mindfulness, empathy, and reciprocity. You look at socio-emotional learning, a hugely scaled effort to build key competencies for lifelong, so many social and communal benefits in kids by building these competencies early in kids. The SEL key competencies are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making. The IDGs, being, thinking, relating, collaborating, acting. When you dive into these things, there's so much convergence and consilience in these. It also turns out that there are 5 of them all these times, which is itself interesting. So there's real overlap. There's not just in the capacities, but also and the synergies between them that, again, can be intentional. But in this notion of kernels, the practices. So I show you something from the Harvard Education School where they looked at 24 well-tested socio-emotional learning interventions, packages that get at those 5 competencies. And they listed in all of them that they actually used 430 something different practices to achieve those competencies, capabilities. And they found out when they compared that all of those practices could actually boil down to 5 kernel practices, which were low cost. A kernel had to, by their criteria, were things that had to be low cost, fairly easy to learn, and cut across all the interventions, so that they were really distilled versions of that larger universe. And I would think that there are a lot of kernels that we share in the IDG frameworks, in a nurture effect framework, and particularly psychological flexibility as a key thread in a lot of the intervention pooling we're doing, that there are a lot of overlapping kernels, which is great to identify, because one, it shows a way of an entry into a whole set of learning about how to implement at scale that we don't have to learn over again, and taps into whole other systems to also channel whether the sort of work we're trying to do, the sort of work you're doing, like education systems, like systems that have absorbed many of these same kind of capabilities and capacities. The ones that I rattled off are very similar to the ones that are rattled off when you look at key principles of sustainable peace practice. When you look at Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning, share common resource, share the conditions for common resource sharing practices, what makes those altruistic incentives work. They all kind of converge, and that allows for comparability, for ease of measurement, for ease of explanation to communities, what we may be offering them, so they're real partners. So we can make those clearer to help scale, learn, grow, and engage. Anchors and paths. I think we're opening up, and we'll be recruiting networks of anchors for our scaffolding for scale. There will be many of the same kind of anchoring partners that will help spread IDGs and the purposes that you want to put them to. So therefore, all the above, a lot more learning, and the realistic possibility of leveraging what we're doing to really be more than the sum of its parts to scale. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks so much for your attention. Again, sorry I couldn't be there with you, and hope you have a productive conversation. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Gary. And that is quite some rich material there, I believe, that brings so many different initiatives. He talks about the global ecosystems, and then there's interventions, and just to give us to help us in understanding, perhaps, or shedding different light and perspective as well on what Gary shared, but also what the landscape of these interventions in this work is doing. I want to invite Kara Cooper, who you have also gone in depth when it comes to exploring the nexus of the inner and outer sustainability. I want to just hand the floor to you, really, to give your perspective from the research that you've done over these past years and your experiences work as well with different communities. If you'll give us some perspective on Gary's input and also share some of your findings. What is it that we really need to get right from your observation and deduction?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's quite a big question. We only have the planet and humanity to put in consideration there. So big question, but yeah, thank you, Gary, for your contributions, and really wish you could be here. And I think that the core takeaway from Gary's message to me is that we cannot decouple mental health from planetary health. And with that, considering higher taxonomies of trauma by climate change and the pandemic, and also the direct and indirect trauma experienced by environmental workers. As Jamie reminded us, climate communicators aren't being heard. And so I think bringing that into the fore is important in this conversation as well. And Gary brought up the point of the need to get the ecosystem right and the importance of context. And that's very much where my work is situated. And this paradox of needing to urgently act and respond, coupled with a need to slow down and pause and ensure that how we are responding isn't creating challenges elsewhere. So I come to this work from more of a sustainability background, infectious disease management, engineering, best practices for assessments, and power sharing partnerships in intercultural spaces. That's kind of my background. And in these different contexts, I have noticed a pattern of very linear problem solution responses to very wicked sustainability challenges. This kind of almost single narrative framing that overlooks systemic constraints to transformations. And it also leaves very little space for diversity and humility and reflexivity in these sense-making processes that we're using to make sense of these big issues. So I became very interested in how inner and outer dimensions could synergize and support mutually reinforcing feedbacks for sustainability. And I was also very interested in how well-intentioned interventions for inner transformation could actually become detrimental to sustainability, especially when we consider how the value systems of agents driving these transformations tend to determine what is to be sustained and for whom. So I developed a multiple needs assessment framework to bring together the IDGs and the SDGs and to link inner and outer sustainability requirements. And I use this matrix to evaluate how interventions for inner transformation aligned with broader outer sustainability requirements at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I found, I looked specifically at mindfulness-based interventions. And what I found was that they were often very supportive of individual psychological capacities linked to compassion and empathetic resonance. And Gary mentioned quite a bit on mindfulness there. What I also found was that many of these interventions had opportunities to be recontextualized in a way that would support conditions for collective long-term viability, so moving beyond individual mental health, but towards a more collective long-term flourishing. And to do this, we needed to move towards more of a transcontextual awareness of systemic factors that undermine these conditions for collective well-being. So for example, not treating frontline worker burnout or moral injury as a lack of mindfulness or as a symptom of lack of resilience, but rather a manifestation of unsustainability in the medical industrial system at large. I also found that existing practices could be recontextualized in a very beneficial manner. For example, using mindfulness by anesthesiologists to turn off intubation gases between patients to reduce emissions. So there's a lot of opportunity to recontextualize what is already in practice. And building off this work, I work at the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience. We're now looking at exploring how to ensure that growing efforts to leverage inner dimensions are telecoupled in a way that nurtures conditions for resilience and reconnection, but especially that they're attuned to culturally sensitive dimensions. So exploring that liminal space between systems and the cultivation of new ways of thinking and being and relating and sensing that may not even be imaginable within the current worldviews that we're working with. And so how can we nurture these conditions for readying for change instead of trying to accelerate movement towards one specific target? And we're partnering with groups in medicine, climate change activism, conservation, and arts. And just to give you a bit of an example, kind of bring it down to the ground, we're developing some evaluative tools to assess the readiness of organizations who want to bring inner transformation into their spaces, and some pedagogical experiments to support learning as well as unlearning, bringing that which is unconscious in dominant paradigms and worldviews and trying to make that more conscious. And one of the main drivers behind this work is a response to increasing interest from settler organizations to engage with Indigenous peoples and wisdoms, especially in the inner transformation space. And I want to highlight why this is incredibly important and needs to happen absolutely. It can also create tension when the same groups aren't making a concerted effort to recognize, interrupt, and challenge dominant colonial systems in which they are complicit. So what happens in these cases is that even with well-intentioned people and organizations, they have really great aspirations, they can create insidious challenges elsewhere that undermine conditions for collective and long-term flourishing. And this happens when organizations extract Indigenous knowledge without consent and reciprocity in order to benefit non-Indigenous groups by forcing non-Indigenous worldviews, mindsets, goals on the transformational process, and also trying to accelerate transformations to suit settler agendas and timelines. So some of the work we're doing right now is really looking at how we can help settler-based organizations move towards more sustainable and meaningful partnerships with Indigenous peoples, and to borrow words from Drs. Sharon Stein and Vanessa Andreotti, gesture towards more decolonial horizons of possibility in these transformative spaces. So part of that is also involved with how do we build the endurance to remain present with the uncomfortable processes that accompany inner transformation. I think I'll leave it at that because we're going to break into a panel. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of my work and the current projects we're building on now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll actually just invite up Jamie and Fredrik straight away, and the two of you will segue this into the conversation, I believe. Do you want to perhaps start with a brief comment there, Fredrik, on bringing the perspectives of Gary and Kira together side by side, and then we transfer to Jamie as well to include your take on this.
I want to be allowing some space for Jamie first, and then I'll come in. So that's okay. So please go ahead, Jamie. What's your first thoughts?
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think I pointed to the convergence already of what work that we're doing from quite different domains of academia, and like I say, the more kind of mainstream mental health bodies and civil society is really striking, and certainly some of the themes that you actually, in fact, I'm going to post a quote in the chat which I picked up from the COP² roadmap that Gary mentioned there about capabilities for change, because it could have come almost out of an IDG in a development goals material there. Capabilities for change capture skills, mindsets, and practices that instrumentally enable people to pursue, craft, and implement effective change. And the other thing I wanted to echo, particularly in what Kira said, is us needing to develop more sophisticated understanding of when and how these interventions work, and to see it not as we just need to do some inner work and everything will be fine, but acknowledge that actually systems condition our inner lives all the time, and all we need to do, and what we're suggesting is we also need to acknowledge that the inner conditions the outer, not replacing one with the other and just saying it should be the other direction. But it's really enmeshed. And in fact, if you really scratch the surface, inner and outer as sort of discrete concepts sort of collapses as well, doesn't it? And my initial reflections around the role of relationship and framing the problem in terms of disconnection. I meant to mention comes from my work with Christine Vamsler, whose name has been mentioned a couple of times already, one of the key advisors to the Development Goals. Together, we created the reconnection report that was on Gary's slide. So I'll post a link to that in the chat. And the reason I mention it now is because it really does call for the nuance that Kira's pointing to, which is talking about social mindfulness, as in contrast to perhaps the kind of individualized clinical mindfulness interventions that were brought into Western or modernist society 40 years or so ago, where instead of looking just in terms of our own individual distress, we're instead encouraged to broaden the frame and think, actually, where might the patterns of distress be coming from? Might there be more social determinants? And actually, might I use this new awareness to turn towards and address collective issues, and rather than just the personal things that I can more immediately act upon. So this is, I'm referencing there the work of the Mindfulness Initiative, which is my other hat. I will put a link to that in the chat. But yeah, convergence, consilience, I think was my main resonance there. Thanks, Fredrik.
My reflections are around a few interesting navigation points related to time, because I think it is interesting, and I've been having my own reflections about this a few times during the last couple of months. It's the whole idea that in some ways we're looking into 2030 and some other years as a massive and completely needed mobilization effort to have a lot of things to happen. Sometimes it feels like we're then saying, well, then it's, then we shouldn't continue. But actually the whole space that we have to create is going to be having to be the way that we operate from there on. It's not just going to 2030, it's what happens after 2030 as well. And we're in for the long run. I happened to hear a conversation recently around the founder, William McCaskill of Effective Altruism speaking, and he was identifying how do we start to think long term, and how do we make space to recognize if we are able to survive as a humanity. The mean age of a mammal species is about 1 million years. The humans, Homo sapiens, has lived around 300,000 years, and that means in his calculations that there's 95% more humans to be living on this planet. So it's really interesting in that space around time, because of course we could probably do a lot of things and continue fast, but then completely ruin our relationships to ourselves, each other, and many communities. So yes, that balance of what do we do, how do we do it in order to have the long term, but also not lose the chance, because we suddenly lose, our navigation space because of the harm we're creating. So it's a bit of a philosophical question, but I mean, Kara, that I guess you also are reflecting upon that space, that thinking fast, thinking slow, or acting fast, acting slow, moving on the speed, moving at the speed of trust in some way. How do you resolve those, or how do you think through those kind of what's present now, and what do we do for the long run, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's part of the challenge is holding that paradox between hope and despair. Some have described environmental work as the science of eschatology now. Are we preparing for a doomsday? Are we just kind of mitigating or hospicing a dying system versus holding hope? And there's a paradox there, and there's the paradox between needing to hurry up and act before it's too late, and then slowing down to make sure that we aren't creating problems elsewhere. And I think that's where I kind of sit most of my time. That's my little lily pad, is we need to speed up but slow down at the same time. And it is a huge challenge also, because how we have framed our understanding of the system very much limits the transformative capacity and the transformative vision that we have and the imaginaries that we bring into that space. So we're unpacking the old, trying to rebuild a new, but we don't know what is in between those systems. It's very easy to say this system is unsustainable and broken and we need a new paradigm and we need to fix it and we need this new approach, but it doesn't, in a system, in this organic world that we live in, it's not so simple. And I think having these conversations around the need for inner transformation are incredibly powerful, but at the same time, we really need to nurture capacities to sit with the discomfort of moving between systems. Inner work and inner transformation is extremely uncomfortable a lot of the time, especially the work that we're doing from a decolonial space, recognizing and accepting and changing our own complicity in systems that are perpetuating unsustainability that we are very much benefiting from. The luxuries of modernity that we take for granted, just being able to have this call is very detrimental to many systems, social and ecological as well. So there's a huge challenge there. And we need to really build the endurance to sit with this. And as the world becomes more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, VUCA, we will need more capacities and sensibilities and to cultivate these new skills to help us make sense and to stay present to what is emerging.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there's so much more, I feel like, there to really pick from the richness of this of these perspectives that you bring and that you're making sense out of. I wonder if this is I believe this could also be the challenge question that you raised, Kira, is perhaps something that we can bring out into the smaller conversations as well in the breakout session. How about that? Is there something else that wants to be said right now from the three of you before we go out into breakout sessions and reflect together on what comes alive when you hear these perspectives, and how does that land in your particular context?
Yeah, there's perhaps one thing it might be helpful to point people towards, and that's the innovation required in getting some of these themes, this conversation, in front of decision makers and into policy conversations, and the kind of innovation in language and framing, and the courage that we need to do that is a kind of an ongoing, is a new and an ongoing project. And I'd like to point people, particularly if you have a sustainability and sort of policy background at all, we have a Inner Development Goals Green Hub, and I'll put a link to that. There's a LinkedIn page you can join. I think it's open to all, but particularly those who have a background in this area and are doing some of that work of trying to get these themes into prevailing narratives.
Beautiful, thank you. So I will be opening up the breakout rooms, and I've tried to keep it to about 4 people in the rooms. And if it should so happen that you are finding yourself without friends in your room, I'll see that and sort of try to make little adjustments as you go along. So please be welcoming to anyone who might be dropping in a little bit late, and understanding for those who might be in traffic or wherever they may be. So, but yeah, we'll take 12 minutes for brief reflections amongst each other, and then we'll be coming back for some harvesting and some group reflecting in plenum afterwards. So see you in a little bit. Welcome back. I hope you had a moment to have some exchange and that it was fruitful. And also, one of the great values of these gatherings is to really get the perspectives of people from the different parts of the ecosystem here that we gather. You know, there's people who've been to many gatherings, there's people who are joining us for the first time, and so really meeting from across the globe is that's an expressed intention. So I want to open up the floor for you all after this opportunity to share with some others in your rooms. What are things that come alive for you? Listening in and taking it in, sensing and thinking and feeling about these pretty large scale questions. Humanity, planet, caring for it. Nadia, would you, if you're able to turn on your video, there you go. Yeah, yes, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for everyone's contributions. I think a question that's really sitting with me is, what are our various theories of change of how the sort of inner psychological resilience that has been discussed, who we target with those initiatives and why? And it's a curiosity that I have. I work largely in business, and so my targets are largely people at the C-, 4 or 5 level and upwards in large organizations, because I see the opportunity that they have a lot of power, and to direct them in a way where they can make different choices going forward if they see the world a different way. And obviously really inspired also by the work that was brought here about doing that at the grassroots level. And then sitting with this question of time, of how quickly that we're going to go and how slowly. And I suppose there's a bit of a confusion or like a swirl in my mind around, are there certain populations that if we target, that we can reduce the impact of climate change faster, to give us more time so that we can slow down in the communities where we do have that pace of that human process that takes its time. The pace of relationships, I think, is something that was mentioned, or even like that pace of having to process these difficult experiences that are coming our way as our systems become more and more disrupted and we recognize less and less of a stable world. So it's a very poorly formed question, but something in the lines of, who does this work need to reach and when? And does reaching certain populations sooner create even more powerful leverage points, to use Jamie's language? And it's something that I don't know, because I only have one lens on it.
Thank you. Wow, that's a really good one. Who wants to take a Jamie?
I mean, it's a really good one, and I'm sure we could spend the next 13 minutes talking about it. There's so much in it. I wonder, Ola, whether we take a couple of questions.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
A couple of more questions, and then try and tackle them together.
Yeah, absolutely. So, any other questions that want to come up and alive?
My name is Alejo, it's from there. Jamie mentioned that the innovation that we need, and we were talking about that in the group, is how to get policymakers involved in this issue. And I would like to know if he can express some more ideas about it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or points, thoughts, reflections that coming from the smaller conversations that want to come up to the table? Jörg as well.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So one of the questions we discussed was about, so let's say, so the language, so it's really different. So for instance, if I work for a German leadership program and using the particular frameworks, could be, I mean, part of it IDGs, but also in positive psychology. And now we're thinking about a program in Tunis for a completely different target group, and we're really thinking about the context, the language, the way how we can approach and address, well, the audience, so to say. And because, I mean, if it's too abstract, we definitely lose the people. If it's too simple, we lose the people as well. So therefore, for me, it's really a matter of how to balance from context to context, from target group to target group. So the way how we speak, the way how we introduce, the way how we set the goals for programs like that. And I'm not talking only about leadership level. I mean, so for the German situation, for the leadership programs could be very highly abstract and introducing to the framework, fine. But I mean, so if we think about the effect per se, so how would it be if we bring the IDG movement and lectures and programs and thinking into situations where people didn't have any kind of an access to attend to training programs like that. And therefore, to think about the difference in terms of language, in terms of approach, that is the question which came up in our small group. Thank you.
All right, so we have who or specific target groups for impact. We have language. We have general other thoughts or reflections around target groups and impact, and we have thoughts about time.
Yeah.
What are
I could jump in because I think there's one particular thread that connects those three around language, target, and particularly policymakers that I'll jump in on. So to answer one of your questions, Nadia, and they were all really on point. The theory of change for the inner development goals has been, to some extent, getting to mass, the largest number of people. And there has been discussion of tipping points, getting to a point where new technologies or cultural trends get to somewhere between 10 and 20%, and it suddenly flips into cultural mainstream. And that's the main thing, really, getting inner development so mainstream that it's considered in policies, processes, and individual lives as a kind of normal and credible thing. However, that is kind of up for debate internally as well as in the hub network, and there is the consideration of particular groups and organizations, individuals who are holding some of the existential risks that we face, speaking to your point about it becoming less and less stable over time, and also holding the reins of power when it comes to sustainable development. And are there leaders, are there organizations, not just going out to as many organizations as possible, but we're targeting particular organizations or particular levels of management who we should be particularly advocating to. And so yeah, it's sort of an open, starting out with a mass, but starting to interrogate that really, and thinking about acupressure points where this would be most helpful. And then the language, of course, of those two are very different. The language for leadership, obviously, as you said, Jörg, country by country, very different tiers in an organization. Or are we going out to culturally mainstream groups? Just going to put my video on and off because I seem to be lagging to myself anyway. But so the one that I understand best is policymakers. To go to Yardo's point. So before joining the Inner Development Goals quite recently, I spent 10 years running a think tank about mindfulness and compassion training, which came out of the British Parliament and works with policymakers around the world. And so I'll just say very briefly that in the British Parliament, at least 300 MPs and members of the House of Lords have had some mindfulness training, and that the success of that program is now spreading in parliaments around the world, like in France, Denmark, places across Europe, but also outside of Europe, places like Sri Lanka. And yes, we've had to really work on the languaging again of how that lands, what you can and what you can't say. I'll put a link to a couple of documents in the chat that I think are very good around that, particularly for getting this stuff over to policymakers. And at that, I will pass over to Fredrik with his hand up.
Thank you. Yes, Fredrik.
Do you want to include a few more questions, or should I just add? I'll do a brief one here. To me, I think what we need to do is to recognize that the way to work forward has to be inclusive. We have to bring the different sectors very closely together, because the time of sort of siloing, doing only stuff for that or for that or for that, is probably one approach that needs to be held up. I think working really on what we know around innovation ecosystems and bringing different categories, businesses together with policymakers, together with civil society, together with place, culture, history, is probably the most sustainable approach over time. The question is how to get there, and I agree there might be a lot of different things, but I think overarchingly, I think our understanding a lot here is that the different allocated roles that different groups and organizations and power bases have in society all have something to contribute, and the trick is how do we build a cohesive approach between all of these, and that, of course, that depends on where the policy systems are, what the interest of the global corporates in a place are interested to do with the others. But I think generally the whole approach to realize that development of these things requires us to be better at working together between sectors. For me, that's really critical.
Thank you. I want to just acknowledge Vera and Laurent as well, and also in having a mindfulness about time and knowing that Kira is off to a climate anxiety event, which sounds really exciting. I want to bring in your perspective as well, and just mention now that I hope that many of you will be able to stay also for the 30-minute more informal afterglow. So, but I would like to bring Kira's perspective into the room, if you would like to reflect as well.
Yeah, thank you. For me, what's coming up with the language is we want one language where we can all know approximately what we're speaking to or what we're gesturing towards, but the danger there is also homogenizing our expectations or our understandings or our worldviews. And so that they're, it's another paradox of needing a language where we can all communicate similar thoughts, but also, which thoughts are being pushed outside of the boundaries of what is understood here. So I think for me, it's really, there's a delicate balance and a dance there between making sure that everyone understands and then also reinforcing or pushing a dominant version or a dominant worldview on these transformations and on what we mean by inner transformation at large, because what is understood as sustainability varies person to person, place to place. And I think this really reemphasizes the importance of context specificity, who we're speaking to, what is important, what should be sustained and for whom, and what are some of the broader essentially framings of sustainability at large. I think this is important things that we bring into conversation, whether it's at the policy level, the grassroots level, and really understanding that there's a whole ecosystem of definitions and things we need to consider. So being very careful around that.
Yeah, being mindful of context, language, and power, or yeah, the locationality in ecosystems as well. We have almost reached time, and although there's no end to this conversation, that's the point as well. I believe that this is the work continues, and that it will need to happen as we also talked about, it will need to happen in all the different contexts, and we will need to loop back in for the sense making. You know, like you brought, Jörg, like I'm working in this particular context. How can that meet what Kira has learned from working in the context that she works from, and that the perspectives and the context really do flow and inform each other. So we've been together for an hour and a half, and I want to invite you all, as I mentioned, to join for another 30 minutes in the afterglow. And I want to respect those who need to leave for whatever reason. And I will invite us all to what has become a bit of a tradition, to just leave by turning on your screen, if possible, your video, and to say thank you and goodbye in your respective languages. And then we'll continue with Afterglow after that. So, tack.
Tack så mycket.
Vielen Dank.
Tusen tack.
Goodbye.
Merci. Au revoir. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Tot ziens.